good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, whatever it is for you. This is Chapter 5, Part 1, so obviously there will be other parts to this chapter. This first part is dealing strictly with epithelial tissue. Part 2 of this chapter will deal with connective tissue and a bit about wound healing. I did decide to save Part 2 for Exam 2. I'm not going to put the rest of Chapter 5 on Exam 1. I just thought it would be a little much, so we'll be okay with that. All right, so epithelial tissue. Now, really, this PowerPoint, it's not terribly long, 42 slides, which is pretty short for this class. Also, you've already studied most of the material in this PowerPoint when you studied Lab 3, all right, for lab exercise 3, all about epithelial tissue. So most of this really should be a review for you, but there will be some new pieces here that I'll talk about that will be on your exam. Remember that this PowerPoint, this lecture is going to be covered on Exam 1. So let's get started with it. Tissues. You already know what tissues are. They're groups of similar cells that perform some common function or related function. There are 4 categories or classes of tissue: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, which are covered in lab as well as in this Chapter 5. The other 2 types of tissue we will study later: nervous tissue and muscular tissue. And again, a reminder, an organ is really defined as something that has a structure that's going to be composed of at least 2, often more, types of tissue. Histology, you know, histo. The word histo means tissue. So this refers to the study of tissues. Here's sort of a summary, of where you can find examples of where you can find the 4 different types of tissue. All right, so we're honing in on epithelial tissue at this point. All right, so epithelial tissue forms boundaries, all right, between different environments. Example of that would be the skin. The skin is the most popular boundary between the outside world and the inside of the body. Epithelial tissue has a variety of functions, which you already know that if you studied Lab 3. Some epithelial tissue, if it's stratified, will play a protective role. If it is simple or not stratified, then it's going to play the role of secretion, absorption, filtration. You can find epithelial tissue lining digestive tract organs and other hollow organs. And then I already mentioned skin surface. Connective tissue we'll get into later, as well as nervous and muscle tissue. But we're really just going to focus on epithelial here. All right. Embryonic tissues. So, of course, we need to mention a little something about what are known as the primary germ layers. So basically, when you're an embryo, all right, when you're an embryo, you are composed of 3 layers. They're called germ layers. Okay, 3 primary germ layers. You are made of this when you are an embryo. And all tissues develop from one of these layers. So we need to know the names of these 3 layers and kind of a little something about these. So what's going to end up happening is that you have 3 layers that are just laying right on top of each other, and eventually those are going to start to meet. So the layers are going to start to form a tube, right? So you will be essentially, as an embryo, a tube made of these 3 germ layers. So it says here superficial to deep. The 3 germ layers are ectoderm. Ecto kind of means like outside, all right? So that's going to be the most superficial layer, the most external layer, ectoderm. The middle layer is called mesoderm, easy to remember. M for mesoderm, M for middle. And then the deepest layer is called the endoderm. Remember, you're going to start getting familiar with some of these prefixes and what they mean. Endo means inside or inner. All right, and yeah, these are formed in early development. and as I mentioned, they are going to develop into the specific types of tissue. And so your question on an exam will be related to your knowledge of what tissues come from what primary germ layers. Okay, so nervous tissue comes from ectoderm. You should know that muscle and connective tissue come from mesoderm. And you should know that epithelial tissue actually comes from all three. Okay, epithelial tissue comes from all three layers. All right, and yes, of course, as part of sort of related to the epithelial tissue, we have something called mucous membranes, and these are also going to come from these layers, all three layers, and they're going to start to line the digestive or form the lining of the digestive and respiratory tracts. Here's a little picture here of the germ layers. Okay, so this is showing a 16-day-old embryo. So at this point, at only 16 days, this is all you are, all right? You are three layers. You are, and it's showing them. Okay, so on the inside in yellow here would be the endoderm, and in the middle would be the mesoderm, and then the outer layer would be the, oh gosh, my cat. I'm sorry, guys. I gotta let this cat out. She's gonna drive me. Sorry about that. I should have just paused the video. Anyway, right. So we have our primary germ layers here. Again, just know the three and what is going to come from each layer, right? So epithelium is going to come from all three layers. The endoderm, the endoderm is actually also going to form part of the digestive lining. And nervous tissue is going to come from the outer layer, which is the ectoderm, and then the middle layer or the mesoderm is eventually going to form muscle and connective tissue. Now, eventually, these three layers here, they're going to meet. All right, the ends of them are going to meet, and they're actually going to end up forming a tube, and that tube will eventually become the human body. Epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue really is going to be covering body surfaces or cavities. Now, there are two kinds of epithelial tissue, two classes. So you have covering and lining epithelia. And so this you will find on external and internal surfaces. All right, they're going to be lining something, helping to form a boundary. Because again, that's part of the function of epithelial tissue as a whole, is to help form a boundary. And again, skin is the most popular example. As you know, maybe think to yourself right now, what kind of epithelial tissue makes up the skin or the most superficial part of the skin? That would be stratified squamous. All right, then maybe you remember the other layers of the skin, what tissues those are made of. You've got the epidermis made of stratified squamous epithelial. You've got the deeper dermis, which is going to be made of, maybe you all remember, it's actually a connective tissue called dense irregular connective tissue. We also have areolar connective tissue there because remember that areolar connective tissue is the type of connective tissue that lies deep to all epithelial tissue. And then deepest to that, you have your hypodermis, which is made of adipose. So put all that together. All right, those are the main tissues that you find in the skin. What is the second class of epithelial tissue? It's called glandular. And for obvious reasons, all right? This means this is epithelial tissue that lines glands, okay? All the different glands of your body. And again, what are the functions of epithelial tissue? Well, you have a variety of them depending on the structure of the tissue. So special characteristics of epithelial tissue, there really are 5 distinguishing characteristics that you really should know about and you should associate with being unique to epithelial tissue, and we are going to talk about them. Definitely you will have a couple of questions relating to these main characteristics of epithelial tissue as a whole. First of all, epithelial tissue has something called polarity, all right? Not all tissue has this. Polarity means it has a top and a bottom. It's oriented in this specific way because what does epithelial tissue do? It forms boundaries. So it has to have a top, for example, facing an external side, and it has to have a bottom facing the deeper or more internal side. So yeah, epithelial tissue has a polarity. And you can break this top and bottom side down into these specific names. And definitely we're going to mention these, and you should know these. So the top part of the tissue is called the apical surface. This is going to be the free side. It's going to face some sort of external side. If you use the skin as an example, right? The most superficial part of the skin, which is made of stratified squamous epithelial, right? That most superficial side of it, the most outer part, faces the outside. It faces the free side. There's nothing above it. When you're looking at a slide, for example, and you're looking at this tissue, epithelial tissue, if you'll notice at the top there's nothing, right? At the top there's no other tissue. So that represents the apical surface. All right, and then you know that some of these apical surfaces have specialized features such as microvilli and cilia. The basal surface, basal, when you see this, it comes from the word base. Base or basal means bottom. Think of like your basement. The basement in your house is at the bottom of the house. So basal always means bottom. So this is going to be the deeper side of that epithelial tissue, which is going to be connected to the deeper connective tissue, because as you know from lab, we mentioned that connective tissue underlies or is deep to all epithelial tissue, right? So the basal surface is the part of the epithelial tissue that is attached to that deeper connective tissue. Now, we do have some other more specific terminology. So the basal surface is also attached to this, at its deepest part, is attached to something called the basal lamina. So again, base meaning bottom. Lamina often is referring to some kind of connective tissue. Okay, so the basal lamina is just beneath the epithelial tissue, and it's the specific part that's going to connect the epithelial cells to the underlying connective tissue. So second major characteristic of epithelial tissue that you need to know is that the cells that make up epithelial tissue form very specialized contacts with each other. And again, this is pretty unique. So for example, you don't find this in connective tissue. All right, the cells that make up connective tissue, they don't have specialized contacts like you find in epithelial tissue. And this is because the cells of epithelial tissue are going to fit closely together. They're going to just they're going to fit together perfectly, right next to each other. And this allows us to make these continuous sheets of epithelial cells. And so we are going to mention the specific kinds or the names of these specialized contacts. All right, so each epithelial cell has a lateral connection to another cell by way of these specific kinds of junctions or connectors. So tight junctions are a form of specialized contact that you can find between some epithelial cells. Desmosomes, that is a second type of specialized contact. It's basically a complex of structures that serves to connect epithelial cells together, all right? Tight junctions also, but desmosomes really are more complicated, and we are going to mention a little bit more about them. So what is another feature or special characteristic of epithelial tissue? And that is that all epithelial tissue is supported by an underlying connective tissue. All right, and so between the epithelial layer and the connective tissue layer is this layer, another layer called the basement membrane. So the basement membrane, you should know, is made of 2 layers. And I already mentioned the basal lamina. Okay, so basically, I'll just repeat this. So you have your superficial epithelial tissue. Just deep to that, you have this structure known as the basement membrane. The basement membrane is made up of 2 layers. All right. The most superficial part of the basement membrane is called the basal lamina. Now, this is mostly made up of epithelial tissue, but you start to see some connective tissue in there as you approach the deeper layer of the basement membrane, and that is called the reticular lamina. The reticular lamina is all connective tissue. Basically, what you're seeing is a transition here, all right, from epithelial tissue to connect to the deeper connective tissue, right? So most superficial, you have your epithelial tissue. Just deep to that, you have your basement membrane, all right? And the first part of that basement membrane is the basal lamina, which is mostly epithelial tissue, but into connective tissue represented as the reticular lamina. Now, once you go deep to the reticular lamina, then you run into completely connective tissue. Okay, so you should know this arrangement from superficial to deep. All right, so I'll say it again. You've got your epithelial tissue. This is superficial to deep. Epithelial tissue, and then you're into your basement membrane, which the next deepest down would be the basal lamina. Next would be the reticular lamina, and then deep to that would be your connective tissue. So you should basically know that order. Why do we have connective tissue beneath epithelial tissue? Because it helps reinforce and support the overlying epithelial tissue. And connective tissue is really, really strong because it has something in it called collagen, which you all know. We've talked about collagen and the function of collagen. Collagen provides tissue with strength. It can help provide strong support. Okay, so that's why we need that connective tissue with all that collagen to be deep underneath that, deep to the epithelial to support it. It's also going to help resist stretching and tearing of epithelial tissue and of deeper tissue. All right, and remember this basement membrane is going to help. It is really what defines the difference between epithelial and connective tissue, where they sort of are distinguished from each other. Special characteristic of epithelial tissue, and this is a really important one for you to know, and that is that epithelium is avascular. When you see that letter A in front of a word, all right, that means without. So vascular means vessel. So this means without vessels. Okay, so really important that you know this. Epithelial tissue is not vascular. Okay, so there are no blood vessels in epithelial tissue, none. Now the deal is that, okay, you got to think about this. So blood vessels are not in the epithelial tissue, but they are in the underlying connective tissue. Okay, connective tissue that lies deep to epithelial tissue is vascular. That's where all your blood vessels are. All right, and so think about this again. I'll use the example of the skin. So you've got, let's say you get a cut on your skin, which I just got a pretty big one today. I dropped a big piece of some glass, broke all over my foot. I thought I had to get stitches. It was pretty scary, but anyway. So let's say you get a little cut on the skin. Well, think about it. If you get a paper clip or something real superficial, you'll notice there's no bleeding. Okay, what that means is that you did not penetrate the connective tissue. That means you did not penetrate the dermis. You only penetrated the epidermis. Okay, because if there's no bleeding, that means, well, there's no vessels there, correct? Now, if you do bleed from a cut, that means you have this cut has penetrated the dermis. It has penetrated the connective tissue underneath the epithelial tissue. Okay. So another deal, something to kind of keep in mind with this is, well, then, you know, blood vessels are what help transport healing chemicals to an area after injury. All right. So if you do have an injury to the skin or whatever, how do you heal from it? Like, how do you heal the epithelial tissue if there's no blood vessels there? Well, the very deepest parts of the epithelial tissue will receive some sort of nutrition and receive access to some of the cells and the chemicals coming from the immune system that travel through the vessels of the dermis. Okay, so the fact that the connective tissue, specifically the dermis, that has the blood vessels, it is able to, just because of close proximity, give a little bit of that to the deep parts of the epithelial tissue. What we're going to learn is we can relate this when we talk about skin to, the fact that, well, the most superficial layers of your skin are dead. They're dead. And part of the reason that the most superficial layer cells of the skin are dead is because there are no blood vessels at that part. Okay, so anyway, keep that in mind. Real important quality characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it is avascular, but it is innervated, which means it does have a nerve supply. So you are able to receive sensation, right? Because you have nerves, sensory nerves, that are projecting all throughout your epithelial tissue. So yes, you are able to feel things because of this. You can feel pain and temperature and all that kind of stuff because you do have innervation there, but you do not have vascularity there. Next special characteristic, and this is another real important aspect or characteristic of epithelial tissue that you should know. Epithelial tissue is highly regenerative, highly regenerative. And this is unlike all of the other tissues, all right? This is very unique to epithelial tissue, all right? You have an incredible ability for cell division, all right? Epithelial cells are really great and very quick at dividing. So if there is an injury and you have a loss of cells, epithelium, they're going to grow back for the most part, all right, unless you've penetrated really deep. Okay, so yes, they're very highly regenerative. And keep in mind also that epithelial cells, we're not just talking about the skin. We have all the linings on the inside of our body, all right? All the linings of our organs are composed of epithelial cells. So even an injured organ, all right, you can get recovery, okay, of those epithelial cells because they are highly regenerative. Now, if the connective tissue portion of an organ is damaged, then you're in trouble. That's when you have scar formation and you will have loss of function. And we'll mention that when we talk about connective tissue, okay? But with epithelial tissue, no, it is highly regenerative, okay? So new cells, if you have an injury, new cells are going to regenerate from the bottom, all right, from the basal layer of the epithelial tissue. It is the cells at the base layer that are doing the cell division, all right? And so as these new cells are made at this basal portion, these new cells push old cells off, okay? And so you actually shed or lose those old dead cells, and these new cells will then migrate towards the surface or up towards the apical surface, giving you a brand new sheet of epithelial tissue, basically. And this is important in the skin, of course, because we're always exposing ourselves to friction, hostile substances in the environment, which, can damage your cells. So there really is a need for this. It makes sense then why epithelial cells would be so highly regenerative. There's a major need for that because we're constantly destroying, killing off, and losing our epithelial cells, at least on the skin. Okay. And then again, for this regeneration to happen, you do need to have some close proximity to some blood supply, right? Because remember, epithelial tissue is not vascular. So, it is important, again, understand that the importance of the relationship between epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Connective tissue provides some of that much needed nutrition at the basal level of the epithelial tissue. All right, so those were the big characteristics. Now, what about functions of epithelial tissues? Yeah, you can read through this whole list, but I'm actually going to go through the tissues and, we're going to talk a little bit about it. I don't want to dwell so much on it, though, because I feel like hopefully you all have studied all of this already from lab. All right, so I'm going to try to be quick with it. You already know how we classify epithelial tissue. based on number of layers and the cell shape. I'm not even going to go through it because hopefully you have already studied this. Keep in mind, though, that this is not just for lab, right? We went through all this in lab, so you'll be asked about it in lab, but you will also be asked about it in lecture. Okay, so this PowerPoint really shouldn't be too bad for you compared to the other ones because, you know, this is like a repeat of what you've already done in lab. All right, so I really don't expect this to be too much for you. All right, so again, cell shape, number of cell layers. Here's a picture. We've got simple epithelial. We've got stratified epithelial. You've also got pseudostratified epithelial. Cell shapes, squamous, cuboidal, columnar. Again, I'm not going to dwell on that because you hopefully have already studied that. Okay, again, this is just sort of breaking these types of epithelia down for you. So simple epithelia, remember that if you have a simple tissue, it's only one layer. So that means you've got to relate structure to function here. So if there's one layer, that means it's going to be easy for substances to pass in across this cell layer. There's not much stopping it. So therefore, relate structure to function. So what's the function going to be of simple epithelia? Things like secretion, absorption, filtration, that kind of stuff, okay? All right, again, so you can have simple squamous, you can have symphoidal, simple columnar, or pseudostratified columnar, right? And we went through that in lab. All right, it's pseudo because it's falsely stratified. It's not stratified, it's actually simple, right? And the reason it looks like it's stratified is because the heights of these cells are of different levels, right? You have some that are a little shorter than others, others are really tall. And so that means the nuclei are going to be looking like they're in different places, and they are in different places, all right? They're not all one straight line like you see here, like simple, for example. They're all over the place. So it looks like many layers. Remember, goblet cells are going to be secreting mucus. And you really find this predominantly in columnar, simple columnar, which you find in the intestines, and also with your pseudostratified columnar in the upper respiratory tract. Breaking it down some more, so simple epithelia, again, it's simple, so it will do absorption, secretion, filtration. Okay, so then where would you find this tissue? You're going to find this tissue where you need those things to happen. Kidney, we're constantly doing reabsorption, actually. Secretion, we're doing filtration. We need this rapid diffusion to be happening in the kidney, and we need gas exchange to be happening in the lungs. That's why you find simple squamous there. We're having gas exchange, diffusion of gases. All right, so some new terms that you should know about. I'm sure you'll have a question about it at some point. All right, so regarding simple squamous epithelial, there actually are two kinds that you should know where they are, okay? So something called endothelium. Don't get that word confused with epithelium. Endothelium is a kind of epithelium. Endothelium, you should know, is the kind of simple squamous that is going to line your vessels. That's really the big location for the endothelium. It serves as the kind of simple squamous that you find in your blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and you do find it in certain areas of the heart. Second type of simple squamous is mesothelium. Mesothelium makes up the serous membranes. So remember, we talked about the serous membranes already. Okay, so we talked about all that terminology with the serous membranes. Serous membranes, you can have a parietal layer and a visceral layer, right? And in between those two layers, you have serous fluid circulating. Well, those membranes are actually made of simple squamous epithelium, and we call that mesothelium. I know you've all heard of this word before. So You've all heard commercials about mesothelioma and the lawsuits. So mesothelium or mesothelioma is a cancer of the mesothelium. Okay, so now you kind of have an idea on what that is. So what happens is people who have mesothelioma, a lot of them were maybe a lot of them were construction workers or are factory workers or people that rebuild homes, old homes, maybe old abandoned homes that have been sitting around for 30, 40 years, and they go and decide to revamp it. Well, you know, when something sits for that long a period of time, or when you have a factory or something where the ventilation is not, you know, maintained, you know, you get toxins. You get bacteria, you get toxins that accumulate. And so if you're in that environment, well, you're breathing that in. So those toxins get into, guess what? They get into the serous membranes that are lining, guess where? The pleural cavity and the lungs. Okay, so this is what mesothelioma is. It's a cancer of the mesothelium that lines the pleural cavities because these people have unfortunately inhaled these toxins, and it is causing cancer of the mesothelium. So that's what that is. All right, again, gonna give examples of all these. I really don't want to dwell too much on it because I feel like you've already studied this stuff in lab. All right, simple squamous epithelium. Remember that simple squamous epithelium, one type, you have endothelium and mesothelium. We're going to have secretion of fluid, right? Look, secretion of serous fluid is a function here because what makes up the mesothelium? Simple squamous. All right, remember mesothelium, that is your serosa. Okay, and so that serosa secretes the serous fluid. And these other places you already know. What is a glomerulus or what is glomeruli? Part of the kidney. Oh, by the way, on the lecture exam, you are not going to be asked to identify any tissues by sight. On the lecture exam, you will not see any pictures and be asked to identify it. That you will have to do for lab. For lecture, you still want to know the structure of all these tissues. All right, you'll be asked about the structure, even though you won't be asked to identify site. And just like with lab, you will definitely have questions about the functions of these tissues and where you will find them. Okay, so just like you studied this for lab, you want to know the same material for lecture, same thing. All right, and I like these tables here. These are not from your book, but I did add these because I really like them because they give you a description of the structure and a picture of it, and then tell you the function, and they tell you location. Okay. Simple squamous, you've seen it before. Simple cuboidal, it's simple, so it's going to secrete, absorb. You should know that the kidneys have this, the kidney tubules, and also ducts of glands all over the body have this. Simple cuboidal, remember you kind of look for your ring structures. In some cases, it might be a really long like structure. It may not be perfectly round. Right? They're going to vary. So what you're looking at here are kidney tubules. Again, we have absorption, secretion. We have, it says mucus production and movement, not just mucus. That's just an example. All right. Simple cuboidal secretes all kinds of products, not just mucus, because simple cuboidal lines glands. So all glands, salivary glands, sweat glands, pretty much all of them. Okay, another picture here of simple cuboidal. You can look at that. Again, I just want to give you a lot of pictures, you know, because there's so much variation on these tissues. Simple cuboidal, I have been showing you as like perfectly round, right? That these cuboidal cells are going to line some kind of perfectly round lumen. But keep in mind, they may not be perfectly round, right? And in this case, look, again, what's highlighted in blue is the tissue, the simple cuboidal. And again, this one, for example, is showing like a long, narrow sort of lumen, all right, or tube. Simple columnar, remember simple, so we're doing absorption, secretion. And recall your special features that you find on simple columnar, okay? Microvilli. Now, some have cilia, all right, but we really focused on microvilli. And know what your function is for microvilli. Remember that. Secretion. Where do we find this? Largely, we're going to find this all along the digestive tract, but there are other places you find it. Simple columnar, some pictures. Notice your cells here secreting mucus. Again, all this is repetitive. Again, just going through functions, locations for all these. Same thing, simple columnar. Just more pictures of simple columnar. What's highlighted in blue is the tissue. This one here is showing a little goblet cell. Okay. Pseudostratified, very interesting tissue. And again, this is all repetitive. Remember, this is a single layered tissue. It is going to be, because it's actually a simple tissue, it's going to be involved in secretion, especially mucus, because we also have goblet cells here. Most of these are going to be ciliated, and they're heavily associated with the upper respiratory tract. So when I say upper respiratory, I'm meaning from the nasal cavity all the way down to the bottom of the trachea. Okay, this tissue does not make up the entire respiratory tract, only the upper. So once the trachea starts to branch off into bronchi inside of the lungs, and then those bronchi are going to even break off into bronchioles, and then those bronchioles are going to branch off into alveoli. That's the lower respiratory system, right? Okay, lower respiratory system is referring to the bottom of the trachea down to the alveoli. You don't find this there, only the upper respiratory tract. Picture of it, again, your nuclei are going to look like they're all over the place. Really noticeable cilia, goblet cells. Again, review your locations, functions for all this. Again, pseudostratified. Or pictures of pseudostratified, columnar. So for stratified tissues, we're only dealing with two kinds of stratified tissue here in this class. So if it's stratified, it has multiple layers. And because it has multiple layers, it's not easy for things to pass through it. Therefore, its function is going to be protection. Now, stratified squamous is really the main one we deal with in this class, but you should know these other ones exist. There is such thing as stratified cuboidal. There is such thing as stratified columnar, but both of these are pretty rare, especially stratified columnar. But you can find these in various parts of the body, especially in areas of transition. So like digestive system, as you go down throughout the digestive system, the epithelial tissue will actually transition into different types. So you might see simple go into turn into stratified and so on, okay? But we're not going to talk about specific examples of stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar. You will deal with that next semester. So we're just dealing with stratified squamous and our other type of stratified tissue, which is called transitional. So stratified, you're going to find this in areas of high wear and tear. All right, great example is the skin. I already mentioned how deeper layers of, especially the skin here, are going to undergo continuous cell division or mitosis. All right, and so the new cells that are formed are going to push upwards towards the superficial surface or the apical surface of the epithelial tissue, pushing off other cells, all right? Eventually, so we're going to talk about something when we talk about the skin, we'll go more into this, about this process of what's known as keratinization, which involves an exfoliation of the epithelial tissue. So don't worry about this yet. We'll deal with that in the skin chapter. I do want you to know, though, for now, let's go ahead and know the difference between the two types of stratified squamous epithelium. You did not have to know this for lab yet. You will have to know it for lab when we do the skin lab. All right, but for lecture, for exam 1, I do think let's go ahead and distinguish these two. Okay, so there are two kinds of stratified squamous. You have keratinized and non-keratinized. Keratinized means that this particular epithelial tissue has a lot of keratin in it. maybe you remember from chapter 2, I believe it was, when we talked about proteins and the different classes of protein. You have fibrous proteins and globular proteins. Fibrous proteins, an example of a fibrous protein is keratin. All right. Keratin plays strictly a structural role. It gives a toughness to this tissue. All right. So you're going to find there's only one place in the body where you find this, only one place, and that is the surface of the skin. Okay. So specifically, when you talk about what kind of epithelial tissue makes up the epidermis, okay, remember we have an epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. Epidermis is the one made of stratified squamous. Specifically, epidermis is the one made of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelia. Right? There's no other place in the body you'll find that. Oh, well, also the hair and nails. What's the other kind? Non-keratinized. So this is the type of stratified squamous that does not have keratin. So that should tell you something here, all right? Remember that keratin is really tough. It's hard, okay? It's going to give sort of a dry quality to something. If it's not keratinized, it's not going to have that quality, meaning it's going to be moist, all right? So this tissue then, this kind of stratified squamous, non-keratinized stratified squamous, is going to line areas where you need those areas to be moist, okay? Moist linings. Example would be like the esophagus, all right? The inside of the oral cavity and the esophagus are examples of that, okay? Because, you know, you need a stratified tissue there because it's an open orifice. And you also need at the same time for those areas to be moist because you're still on the inside of the body in the mouth and esophagus, correct? So because you're on the inside, you can't have that area dry out. You can't have it be keratinized. It needs to be moist. So you should know the basic difference between those. Keratinized, really your big location, epidermis, okay? Again, just, you know, drilling this into your brains, these different tissues. Non-keratinized, remember, open to the outside, esophagus, vagina. Major locations for the non-keratinized stratified squamous. All right, it still does play a protective role, though, just because it's stratified. All right, you've got your stratified tissue there. The next one is the transitional epithelium, and it is stratified. It's multiple layers. Why do we call it transitional? Because the cells change shape based on whatever the end of that organ or tissue is at any given time, which is why this is really a unique tissue, and it's going to be found pretty much in your urinary organs, because it's really in these organs that you're going to have this need, okay, to like, so the ureters and the bladder and urethra, for example, need to be able to accommodate for changes in volume and changes of urine volume, right? So we have to have that bladder able to be stretched out to, if the bladder is full of urine, right? It's going to stretch out. So we need the cells there to be able to change shape to allow that. And then vice versa. When the bladder empties, when there's no more urine there, then we need that bladder to go back to a non-stretched state. So transitional, with this, I like the one on the left here because you can really look at the nuclei and see the shapes of the nuclei. Remember when you're trying to pick out what kind of a cell it is, if it's squamous or cuboidal or columnar, look at the cell shape, right? Something that's cuboidal is going to have a very large round nucleus. Something that's columnar is going to have like a more oval shaped nucleus. So you can see that the nuclei here are of all different shapes, and that tells you this is a transitional tissue because you have different cell types there. Here's another one. All right, same thing you can see here, but you can also see it's transitional again. This more picture, I like to give you a lot of pictures and different ways to look at things. So again, we're really not going to talk about other stratified tissue. The only ones we care about for this class are stratified squamous, and transitional. But do be aware, we do have stratified cuboidal. We do have stratified columnar. And I did mention, especially this columnar is located at transition areas. Example would be like from the esophagus to the stomach, where we're having totally different functions. We need to change the tissue. So we're going to have see this kind of transitional situation there. But you can look at these next semester, all right? Hey, that's it. So I'm hoping Chapter 5, Part 1 is not too bad. Really, you all should know, feel pretty good with this information because you've already studied it for Lab Quiz 3. Okay, so just review it. And, if you're having trouble with the previous chapters, then go back and focus on those. Okay, if you feel like you have a pretty good grasp of epithelial tissue, maybe spend some time on Chapter 3 and so on. All right, well, see you later.